Welcome to Civics for Life, Public Square, presented by the Sandra Day O'Connor Institute. Today, we will focus on the Electoral College. Why does it exist and whether or not we should keep it? My name is Ben Maynard. I am the Director of Civics Education for the Institute.
And I'm Liam Julian. I'm the Director of Public Policy for the Institute.
There we are.
As you can see here is just the core values of the O'Connor Institute. We're an organization, we endeavor to be civil, collaborative, fact-based, inclusive, nonpartisan, and objective. So we present that only to say that perhaps this is sort of the spirit in which our discussion today should occur.
All right, and as background information, we want to note that the Electoral College is a process, not a place. That it is a way that we elect our president and vice president, not through a popular vote, but through contest at each state. And those results from each state weighted based on the population of the state as determined by the US Census. This was done by the founders, the creators of the Electoral College, to ensure that every state had a say in the determination of the president and the direction of the country. And with that, we want to go ahead and get started. And if we could, we want to start with a poll. If we could pull that one up. Okay, and simply, should the Electoral College be changed? Okay. So we will end the poll, and I want to share the results. So most people believe that it should be changed. That's interesting. So we want to invite your comments about this. So if you do have a comment, there is an option to raise your hand in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. If you would click on that, we will call on you in turn. We will get to as many comments as we can throughout our time together today. So
to that poll, interestingly, I saw there was a significant proportion of people who thought the Electoral College should not be changed. And so I think it would be interesting to hear from someone with that perspective. Anybody who says, no, it's good, let's keep it as it is, be very interested to hear your comments on that. And again, you can just use the raise hand icon. Okay, I see a raised hand from Judy Moore. Do we have Judy Moore?
all right.
Okay. All right. Let's.
Well, I had a question, or I had a comment that came in earlier, just by email, by somebody who couldn't be here. So the question was, what are the comments wondering what are the main advantages and disadvantages of the electoral system when compared to the direct vote, which kind of gets to what we're talking about here. Liam, you want to start there? Advantages or disadvantages?
The advantages or disadvantages of direct vote. Well, yeah, I suppose one thing that we could be thinking about there is the smaller states tend to have objections to having it be the case that there is just a one popular vote. The reason being that smaller states feel as if their voice will not be heard in such a scenario. And so it tends to be the case that the Electoral College is seen as privileging smaller states. Would you say that's correct, Ben?
I would say so. Let me pull up a slide to kind of show this. And so if we look at, this is a current map of the United States with the electoral votes, we can see that smaller states obviously get 3 electoral votes, where larger states, say California, get 54. So this protects the interest of, because this really shows the population differences. If we go to this, we see the population densities between both different states. Let me go big screen here so you can see it. And so the darker the color on the map, the higher population totals are in those areas. This is all based on US Census from totals and estimates from 2024. I think the example is always Wyoming as having 520,000 people in the state, where you have 54 million or so that live in California. So being the example of differences, that if you did a direct vote, interest of Wyoming probably wouldn't be considered, because California would be the big draw because of the number of people that live there. Any thoughts about that? Anybody have perspective they would like to share about population densities and differences? Again, there is a button at the bottom to raise your hand, and you are more than welcome to add your comment or your concern. Yes, I see Diane Taylor. Could you, you can unmute yourself and start your camera and give your comment.
The comment that I would have is that this is just to elect the president and therefore the vice president of the United States. It's not to change the fact that their Senate and House representation would not be changed. So why is there this big concern about their views and their feelings in the smaller states with fewer electoral votes? They're not going to be changing how they vote in the House or the Senate. They're still going to have the same amount of representation, if I understand this correctly.
Yes, what we're talking about, if you do change that, if something does happen, that is a way that could that the Electoral College, if there isn't an alteration, it have to happen at a federal level. But yeah, that would could potentially change how those votes are counted and how many votes are allocated.
Yes,
So,
absolutely. Yeah. And just again, to get back to what we were talking about with the smaller states having sort of the Electoral College privileging them in some way, I believe that the case is that the minimum number of electoral votes that you can have is 3. And I think Wyoming does have 3. So essentially you're getting Electoral College votes. You have, each state has 2 senators. So right there you have your 2, and then you get a vote for each district. Wyoming has 1 district. Wyoming, therefore, has 3 electoral votes. And if you look at it in terms of population, for every person who lives in Wyoming, I believe that their vote counts, their vote is 4 times that for every person living in California, when you just look at the Electoral College votes that they receive. So that's where there's a little bit of a discrepancy there, I think, that people have identified. Another thing we might want to talk about too with the Electoral College is that because of the way that it's set up, there really are only a handful of swing states that will decide any election. As we all know, we hear all the time about the swing states, and therefore candidates tend to put their efforts in those states rather than campaigning sort of nationwide. It's sort of assumed that Mississippi will vote a certain way. It's assumed that California will vote a certain way, and those states are unlikely to receive a visit from either Donald Trump or Kamala Harris, and so people don't like that. So some other things to consider as well.
All right. Anybody else have a follow-up question or comment? Desi Carlos? Yes, Carlos, what's your perspective?
Hey, can you see me and hear me?
We can.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for hosting this conversation. My name is Carlos. I am part of an organization called Arizona Talks. And we love topics like this. We really are asking ourselves what we think about the issue as we're watching you here. There's a few of us watching. My biggest question is something that I always ask myself when I get into a position that I'm solid in, and that is, what is the most convincing argument or the best argument in your view to keep the Electoral College as is? Like, we obviously see a lot of different faults for the current system, but what's the best argument to keep it that way?
You know, I'll take the first stab at this, and that is historically that we've gone through two versions of the Electoral College. We have the version from 1787, which was sort of where we started, and then we have the version from the 12th Amendment, which comes from 1803, ratified 1804. They made changes to it because they saw there were some problems with it. That sets a perspective that, or a belief that if there's something wrong with something, you can change it. So I think if there's enough people that see there's something wrong, that there is precedent for it to be changed and modified. Keeping stuff the same doesn't really get to the core of what America's about, and that's to build a more perfect union. So I think that we have to be open to not maintaining status quo, but, you know, changing things as we see necessary. Lee?
Sure, I'd like to hear from other people, in our audience. But I mean, I would say probably that what you could say is the main advantage is that these small states don't get run over by the majority. So the interests of places that are small are still sort of considered. Now, whether it's fair is another question, but small states do get a benefit here for sure. And then that was a big concern, a big concern of the early Americans, right? Is that sort of the more agrarian sort of peoples not have their interests just sort of railroaded by the urban interests. So there's historical reasons.
Okay.
We've got some hands up. Is that Bonita? Oh no, yep, Bonita Worth.
Hi, welcome. Thank you. Appreciate it. This is I'm very interested in this topic. So I have actually two questions. I come from a blue state, and so I often wonder, why do I vote at all? Because we pretty well know how the Electoral College is going to go. I'm from California. And then the second question is, and I'm more concerned about it this election, I was a little concerned about it last election. There are states that have no law requiring the electorals to vote a particular way that the state has voted. So what's the concern about rogue electors or electors who are faithless? That's it.
So yeah, faithless electors exist. They do. There's typically one or two every election, someone who votes another way than the way their state, voted. But it's never affected the outcome of an election. I mean, some states have laws, rules like financial penalties for people that are faithless and electors, and sometimes prison time for things like that. So those are the things states can do for it. Not every state has that instituted, though.
And then my second question, coming from a blue state, how directly does my individual vote work with the election of a president?
Well, I would just say that's certainly one thing to know about the Electoral College, is that actually we Americans, we don't vote for the president. I mean, we do, but we really technically don't. And so your vote in California is part of what is going to what the electors in that state. But your point is well taken, and this is a point that a lot of people make. That especially if someone were to be, say, a Republican voter in California, that person's vote for president is really just doesn't sort of count, so to speak. It still counts in sort of some ways, but and this is an issue. But then that's also an issue that if you happen to be a Democratic voter in California, You also necessarily need to vote. So these are issues, and you're raising good questions.
So are you saying then that if no one voted, the Electoral College would still go ahead with what they do and the president and the vice president would be elected if no one voted?
Nationally, no one voted? Or are you saying if one or two people don't vote?
No, I'm saying if no one voted. What, because again, we're doing indirect voting, right? We're indirectly involved in this process. The Electoral College holds the power. So if nobody voted and we see voting numbers going down across the nation, would we still be able to elect a president and vice president?
So keep in mind that the Electoral College, the power or the electors get their power to vote based on state legislature. The Constitution states that each state legislature can choose how they determine the electors for each election cycle. Now, historically, it has not always been by popular vote. It has been selected by the legislature themselves. That would be something that would have to be done prior to the election date for any legislator to state legislation to change that. But that's part of this, right? That's the possibility of changing one thing that on state level. But I think the other thing to remember about voting is when you vote, you're not just voting for president, you also have state offices, local offices, and other things. So I think it really unlikely that you would ever have a situation where voting stopped completely, because your voice in your local government is more important really than your voice in the national, just because local government has such a impact on your life in terms of taxes, roadways, schools, things like that. All
So
right,
hand up.
and we go to Barbara. Hi, Barbara. What's your perspective? Barbara, you're still muted. We can't hear you.
Okay.
There you
Since realistically, very few people are able to attend any sort of rally or presidential election event, regardless of whether they're in a swing state or not. So most people get their news or their information from other sources than going to an event. So it doesn't matter really whether or not they campaign in my state. Now I happen to live in Hawaii, so we have our 4 electoral votes, and although it used to be only 3, but we'll never see a presidential campaign event here because it's too far to come to for 4 measly votes, and the Democratic candidate is going to get all 4 of our votes because of the nature of our society in Hawaii. So it doesn't bother me. I read the Washington Post. I read the New York Times. I get my news from national television. So they don't have to come here. So I don't mind that they focus on other states because it's reported, and I see the event as it occurs. You know, I've been watching some rallies and having a wonderful time with the entertainment that's going on. So it doesn't matter whether or not they're campaigning in a small state or in a large state. They should campaign in a state that has more electoral votes. They get more bang for their buck that way. And I still hear about it.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Something that Ben had mentioned earlier about the each state sort of determining how they allot their electors. There's a question that I saw here in the comments about 2 of them, about the National Popular Vote Plan. And that's from Catherine. And then Morris said that he had some concerns about the input about electors. So I did want to just talk really quickly about this, the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. And basically, because states can allot their electoral votes as they see fit, there is a compact that is taking place right now between several states where these states have committed to allot all of their electors to the winner of the popular vote. And essentially, this is a way to sort of use the Electoral College to, in effect, undermine the Electoral College. So now, right now, I think there's something that you need 270 electoral votes to win, so to speak. I think right now this compact has a little bit over 200 electoral votes, and so that's just something to keep in mind. And if there are any questions about that, we can answer those a little bit as well.
Okay, Catherine. What would you like to share?
Can you hear me?
We can, yes, ma'am.
Okay. Regarding the national popular vote, I can't exactly remember how many states. I think it's 22 states have supported the national popular vote, and they need like 26 or something like that. And my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, that if we get a majority of the 270 or a majority of states that accept and get the 270, that the rest of the states will follow along with the national popular vote. Will that do you understand that? Is that possible?
Well, so great questions. You're correct. I think there is somewhere in that neighborhood of states that have signed on to it right now. But what determines whether this will choose the winner of presidential elections is not how many states sign on. It's how many electoral votes those states command. So you need to get states totaling 270 electoral votes.
Okay.
And right now, as I said, I think they have a little bit over 200. Now, they're sort of trying to move more in that direction, but the fact of the matter is that they're kind of coming up against opposition from states who basically say, no, we're not going to do this. There's also potential legal complications for this. There have already been some challenges filed. And then there's just sort of the notion of fairness, the people in the states. You can imagine a case, and this is hypothetical, but I've been picking on Mississippi and California, but say Mississippi signed on to this, which I don't believe that they have, but say that they did. And then the winner of the popular vote happened to be, say, Kamala Harris. Then Mississippi would allot all of its electors to Kamala Harris, despite the fact that it's highly likely that the vast, vast majority of Mississippi voters will not have voted for Kamala Harris. And so then you've essentially disenfranchised the people in Mississippi. So it's, again, this sort of trade-off between national and local voices, which are always sort of competing in this conversation.
And I understand. I live in Tulsa, and in Oklahoma, the left vote, the blue vote, whatever you want to call it, is not heard. I mean, even in some of our state and local elections, we are just silenced, and it's disheartening to feel that way. And like the lady was saying a moment ago, when the party that you support won't even set foot in your state, it's a little disheartening. But there's that disheartening point too, to where with the popular vote and the electoral vote, and then who becomes president, it's like that fairness factor. So I will stop with that. Thank you, sir.
And I will throw out real quick, there is another option that has been floated, and that is a sort of proportional allocation of electoral votes. So instead of states giving a winner take all, there are two states that do it now, Nebraska and Maine, where they kind of split their electoral votes by districts. But if more states did that, each state would then allocate based on the percentage of the vote or the general election vote that each candidate received, their electoral votes. And that would change the math a little bit, and other states would come into play more than they are now, because the amount of votes that each candidate would receive in the state would have some bearing on the overall calculus of the votes they, or the electoral votes they received. Let's see, Lily. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah. So like in two elections, like in 2000 and 2016, the popular vote lost to the electoral vote. Is it normal that like people in the Electoral College like vote like with the popular vote in their state?
So is it common that the winner of the popular vote gets all the vote? Well, for the state, typically, yes. Most states, that's the way it works, is that whoever wins the popular vote of that state, they win the all the electoral votes. You were referencing, let me share this chart real quick. So let me go to slideshow. Here we go. So these are the times in our history where this has happened. Was it 4 or 5 times? Beginning in what, 1824, where you've had the winner of the popular vote lose the electoral vote. So it's something that does happen, but typically not that often. So that is and the reason for that is really close elections. That's where you're going to see this, where I think the difference in the 2016 in 3 different states was 50,000 votes total. So that's where typically that comes into play. Okay. Who's next? Jim.
Oh,
Julio, I'm sorry. There you are. You moved down on me.
Hi. It comes down to, do we have the right to an equally weighted vote? And if you live in California or Texas or New York or Florida, your vote count less than if you live in Wyoming or Delaware or Rhode Island. And this is in itself questionably unconstitutional. It's the Electoral College, which is part of our Constitution, in itself unconstitutional because the votes of different citizens are weighted differently. I am realistic enough to understand that it's not likely to change ever because of the small states will never go for it. But that's the basic question. Do we have a right to an equally weighted vote? And under this system, we do not. And it has happened 5 times in our history where a candidate with less votes had actually become president. That's a little bit more than very little. I mean, you know, that's we've had 45 presidents. Some of them have multiple terms, but that's about 10% of the presidents have been elected with less than the popular vote, and that is a concern that impacts potentially issues related to the succession of power and issues related to trust in the electoral process.
Well, what would your idea be to fix it? What would
popular vote?
Every
vote counts the same, and we're not the same country that we were 300 years ago when the Constitution was established. And I realize that there's a system to amend the Constitution, but it is very difficult on this particular issue to get it done. Some issues are even more popular than this one. You can't do it. So we're stuck with this system, but the bottom line is that a better system is direct election with popular vote. Whoever wins, wins. As the lady from Hawaii indicated, you know, the fact that, you know, would the candidates go to Hawaii during this election? Not likely. Although one of the candidates was just in Wyoming, or actually Montana, a couple of days ago, which is one of those states that has a vote that weights a little bit more than mine in my state. But it is you know, we the people should all get together and try to change this and make it a system where whoever gets more votes in a fair election wins.
Yeah, thank you, Julio. And I think you're bringing up a very good point, which is there are there are procedural and political questions about the Electoral College, but there are also philosophical questions that we as a nation kind of need to answer. And so when we answer those questions, then we should have a system that sort of reflects the answers that we gave. And so you were saying that you think it should be one person, one vote, and that those votes should be weighted equally. And that's a philosophical point of view. But if that is your point of view, it is certainly undeniably the case that the system we have in place right now does not reflect that philosophical point of view. So thank you for sharing that.
Okay, let's go to Jim.
Thank you. I guess I'm having a difficult time understanding the thought process that says that a state that has 3 electoral votes within the framework of the Electoral College, that somehow that increases their voice or gives them a voice that they wouldn't have against a state like California that has 40, where I am. And I don't understand that, because it seems to me that it's all about turnout. And if just using round numbers, if there were 100,000 voters in North Dakota that showed up, if all of their voters showed up, how would that differ in terms of giving them a voice in an election than a more populous state? Because the more populous state has more voters. It's difficult for me to understand. But one other point that I would make, it seems to me that if you're trying to get that balance among, or give these smaller states or less populous states a voice that's proportional, that a proportional distribution of electoral votes would be better. Because then at least if you had a 50-50 split, 50-50 for one candidate, 50 for one candidate, 50 for the other, then they'd split the electoral votes and the count would be different. So the people in California, and someone mentioned it earlier, California is routinely a blue state, and it turns out that way, and the electoral votes go that way. But the candidate from the other side also gets they get a percentage of the vote, the popular vote, but somehow it doesn't play into the overall count, because all the electoral votes go to one party. So I'm sort of on the fence. I don't think the Electoral College as it currently exists ought to continue in that way. I think there needs to be some changes to it, certainly. But the popular vote, I'm just not understanding. And maybe you can address that part of it. Thanks.
I can take a shot at addressing it, and I'm sure Ben will have a bunch of corrections to what I say, because he's smarter about these things. But I think basically, Jim, the idea being just that right now, as we said earlier, a person in Wyoming, that person's vote, just by the numbers, is sort of 4 times more powerful than one person's vote in California. Does that necessarily make Wyoming sort of a powerhouse in the Electoral College? No. But were Wyoming to lose the Electoral College, each person there, the sort of impact of their vote would undeniably be lessened. So I think that's the sort of the thought process there. In practice, would it make a lot of difference? I'm not sure. I think I see your point. To what you were saying, some people have brought this up about proportional representation. And I'll just throw one thing to think about out there. Wyoming, for example, let's just stick with Wyoming. They only have 3 electoral votes to divvy up. So what are the proportions? I mean, it can either go all 3, or it can go 2 and 1. And so those are the only proportions that you have available. You can't chop votes up into parts. So this is where we get into a real problem with proportional voting, because there simply are not enough electoral votes to adequately reflect the proportion, if that makes sense. So that's tricky, especially in small states. So, but thanks. Those are really good questions, and a lot of good for thought, Jim. Thank you.
All right. Is it Jared?
Yeah, hi.
Okay.
My name is Jared Scrivener. Let's see, so it seems to me like a common issue with voters is that we see a stranglehold on the 2-party system. It also seems that maybe getting rid of the Electoral College could help getting away from that 2-party system. Am I wrong for thinking that?
I would say you are not wrong. The Electoral College has increased the power of third parties. However, it historically has increased the power of third parties to be decisive in the election of one of the other two parties.
Right.
So the Electoral College has never done anything to get a third party presidential candidate elected, but it certainly has historically swung elections to one of the two major parties or the other. The most recent example coming to mind where this was significantly pronounced was in the election between George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and Ross Perot. And if you actually look at the data, Bill Clinton won the popular vote in Arkansas and the District of Columbia and maybe Puerto Rico. Somebody can check me on this. But Bill Clinton became the president of the United States. He won the popular vote in one state and two jurisdictions, I believe. So Ross Perot was a major third-party candidate that impacted that election. Does that sort of answer your question a little bit, Jared?
Yeah, I think so. It just, yeah, it seems like there is that correlation there, just because if there was an electoral college, it seems that, you know, there would be more parties being able to vie for that, and therefore on the national level, and hopefully that would trickle down to the state level. So I don't know. I was just kind of curious if that was something.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's really about the third parties being able to get a foothold, right? That the political landscape is dominated by our two major parties. It's not that we don't have other parties. We have a Green Party, we have a Constitution Party, but their numbers just aren't big enough to make a real impact, other than in the case of Ross Perot or Nader just playing spoiler for one side or the other. Okay. Other comments or questions? Your opportunity to speak. All right, well, let's see here. I'm looking through the comments. So Morris asked, are we justified in our fears of manipulated technology if we were to just count popular vote? That's a good question. There is a lot of fear around integrity of elections, but I would think that any election process is protected and secured, and I wouldn't think that any popular vote would be any different than the current system we use now, because it would be using the same mechanisms that are in place. Just sort of my thought on that.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in there very quickly to say that other countries seem to be able to do this without any sort of technological issues. Granted, the United States is a large country, but I think we could do it. Again, when it comes to technology, I'm not the best person to ask. I'm barely turn on my own computer, but that's my sense.
So Elizabeth asked that what would be the process to change the Electoral College? So here you would have two options. One would be doing something on a federal level that would require a constitutional amendment, which is incredibly difficult. The other option would be to change it at the state level. And that would be your state legislature changing how it allocates its electoral votes. That is an easier mechanism for that change, but it's almost like the state compact. You would want other states to agree with you to do the same thing. You don't want to be sort of the outlier doing something different, particularly if you're a big state, because you could potentially harm your own political party in doing that. And that's probably what keeps people from doing it. Catherine.
Oh, wait, really quick, Ben. I think
Okay,
Elizabeth had a follow-up question to what you said. She asked, how's the Constitution amended?
Oh, so the Constitution is amended because you have to have an agreement inside of Congress that requires 2/3 of the Congress to agree, and then it has to go to the states, and the states each have to ratify it at that sort of 2/3 level as well. So it's a pretty high bar to change the Constitution. Not as high as it was under the Articles of Confederation, which required everyone to agree, but still a pretty high bar.
Yeah, and I would just add that I think today the reason why we see this, the interstate compact that we discussed earlier, is because I think most people have recognized that changing the Constitution or a constitutional amendment is unlikely to happen, just given sort of interests arrayed right now, how they are. And also very quickly, I would say we're coming up on time here. Probably have just a few more minutes, but I would encourage everyone to do some reading on this. And also the O'Connor Institute had a conversation recently with Dr. Ned Foley, who's probably the preeminent expert in the Electoral College in this country. So talked about a lot of these issues. Really great conversation. You can find that on our website. Maybe we can put the link in the chat. But one thing to look at historically is how many times people have tried to change this historically. The Electoral College is probably the thing that we have tried to amend, reform, throw into the wastebasket more than anything else. I mean, really. So you should check that out. It's fascinating.
Yeah, it's like what 700 amendments have been.
It's in the hundreds.
Yeah, it's crazy. All right, so quickly, Catherine.
That goes to the question you said at federal level could change it or change it at the state level. With the perception of the Electoral College so low, sort of like SCOTUS, excuse me, and the people and the 700 attempts to change the Electoral College, with the we're just tired. We just don't feel like the system is fair. And that's on, quote, both sides of the fence. Should we just roll over? I mean, the lady in Hawaii, the gentleman in California, I'm in Oklahoma, one person, one vote. And the system doesn't, or those who control the system don't want to change the system. But consent of the governed doesn't feel like it's happening. And as the host here, can you, I don't know if you would volunteer this information. Do you support the Electoral College, or do you think there's changes needed for the Electoral College? And throw the population a bone here. I mean, can you give us a little bit of something positive to look at? Thank you.
Well, I think we go back to what Justice O'Connor said, and that is that we need to understand how our government works, and not just by voting, but engaging in it. And what you're getting to is that engagement piece. Like, how do we go to council meetings and have our voices heard? How do we engage with state legislatures, our national legislators, to hear our voices, to hear what we want, and to make them even run for office ourselves if we need to. That's sort of, I think, the question or the answer is sort of what you're getting to, is that if you need to understand how it works and then engaging. And so go to meetings, attend, talk to people. That's the way you create change. Okay, we are unfortunately out of time. We have one more poll that we would like to give you before we leave. If we could pop that up real quick. And that is, given our discussion, has your chance or your stance changed on the Electoral College? And then just has the conversation changed your mind a little bit? And as we're finishing that up, Liam, would you sign us off?
Sure. I'll just say that before I sign us off, I'm fascinated looking at this poll that so many people's minds have been changed during this conversation. That's interesting. That's wonderful. You don't hear a lot about that today, about people changing their minds. So that's great.
Yeah.
I'm glad we could facilitate that conversation. So on behalf of the Sandra Day O'Connor Institute, we want to thank everyone for participating in today's Public Square. This event was made possible through the generous support of the Burton Family Foundation and the American Arbitration Association Foundation. So thank you all again for joining us. And we'll do more of these.
Yes. All right. Thank you.